Hi everyone, my name is Josh and I'm so excited today to be giving my year-end review. Basically, I'm going to be doing a stats review, but I'm doing this a bit different than I have in previous years, where this won't just be raw numbers. I'm also going to be including some of the highlights of each category, whether it be books or videos. So I'm going to try and make this more than just a reflection on the numbers of what I'm reading, but also as a chance to talk about other things that I didn't quite get to mention in my best of videos. I'm really excited. This video took a lot of work, naturally, because of all the stats involved, but it also just makes it all the more rewarding to be able to sit here and look at these beautiful, beautiful figures. So a lot of these figures were actually made using the data analytics tool in ChatGPT. It has become a surprisingly useful tool. I don't use it in my research because I need to be able to make sure the figures I'm making are reliable and replicatable. But for this kind of thing, where I am looking at it as a casual hobby, try to reflect on my own reading stats, it allowed me to try and visualize this data in a brand new way, in a fairly straightforward manner, in a way that I think has really helped make my stats much more interesting than they might have otherwise been, because I had the opportunity to explore different ways of visualizing this data. Let's start with some of the basic data though. There's going to be the total books I read in a month. You can see a great deal of variance here. That's because I had a bit of a slug, especially after January. There was something about, I think, probably my job and just the general dynamic also met the one in February. I just didn't get to as much reading. And that was just a matter of, life fluctuating, different things come up. April, I had a vacation / trip to see the solar eclipse up in northwestern Australia. And that was an amazing trip. It gave me a lot of time to read. And so naturally I had a huge bump there. I also just read a lot of great sci-fi and trans authors that I think made me more excited about what I was reading too. And it wasn't really until this last month, where we get close to the holidays, that I found myself feeling rejuvenated. I really hope I can keep this glide going into the new year, but we'll see. Getting into the pages per month, the actual pages, I just realized my audio wasn't on, but it is now. The actual pages per month on average was about 2255. 2400 was about the average. The median was 2255, but it's still about the same. The standard deviation there about 1150, which is to say in any month I could be reading 1,000 more or less pages than that 2400 average. So it tells you there's a great deal of variance. I think it really reflects a state of mind and how varied that can be, and how some months, especially when I'm traveling, like say in August and September, that can really impact how much I'm reading. Still, it helps me as I plan forward, thinking about what is a reasonable goal. Maybe in the future, same with my last one, well, the average was I think 7 books in a month. I think 7 or 8 books per month on a TBR is a good thing to aim for, even though I will constantly be striving to keep up that pattern of reading more. Not because I need those numbers to be higher, it's just I like reading, and it's something I enjoy doing, and it's just a matter of making it a priority in my life, something I've said before, and that's just the way I'm thinking about this. Now, focusing on the distribution, a histogram of sorts, of the number of books per pages, and I guess the graph speaks for itself, really. You can see the average was about 345 pages, which isn't that different. I think it's a little bit higher than previous years. The standard deviation is about 200 on top of that 345. And I think that speaks to some of the longer books that I read. I feel pretty good about having all these books that are well over 600 pages. And I don't know when it happened or how it happened, but I'm glad that I'm making it happen, especially since some of my favorite books this year, even if they weren't on my best of list, ended up being over 600 pages. I started some really long books, and most of them I think I actually really enjoyed. Now looking at publication years, this is something I want to spend some time on. I think I have a problem because I feel like so much of what I'm reading is focused on the more recent years. There's definitely books in the past that are worth reading, and it's difficult because I think to read so much from modern years has a recency bias, and it assumes that the quality, like we're at peak quality, which is simply not true. If anything, reading newer books means there's less of a consensus around the quality that book has. And while I'm not against reading new books, obviously I read a bunch of them, honestly overwhelmingly new books, I feel as if I'm not getting the value that I want from books, not just from education, but from just an enjoyment and just overall exposure to books that are worth reading, considering just, I only read so many in a month, so many in a year, so many in a lifetime, and that's something that concerns me. Focusing this graph a bit for closer on the 2000s onwards, you can see that especially even beyond just the 2000s and into the 2020s, that is 63, about 2/3 of what I read is in the 2020s. And in my mind, I think that's way too many. And that's something I'm actually going to be targeting as a goal, even though I already did my goals video. Now that I see this, I have actually some specific numbers to actually target myself towards. I'll touch on that once I get through the rest of these years. 2010s, 20% of what I read, 2000s, 6%, and the 1900s, about 10 or 11%. I think the 1900s and 2000s especially are a period where I'm very likely to find books that are modern enough style not to take me out of the book, not to be too difficult of a read, while also being very rewarding. That's part of why I kind of want to focus on those years too. Well, I feel as if I think my raw desire just to expose myself to a larger variety of books is enough to want to do that. I also think it's worth looking at the actual quality of books by publication here. Let's get straight into the average rating of what I've read, but in this case, we're going to be looking at it in terms of it being color-coded by the actual year these books were published. And there's not a lot of pattern other than you can see the dark blues or blues in generals of 2020s are overwhelmingly the color that's on the board. But I think it's also worth noting is that a lot of the modern reads, especially 2023, were 4 books. And it's like 4.0 is a solid book, but I also consider it somewhat mid. I know some people would put 3.0 as a mid, but I think 4.0 generally is like a solid book, but not exceptional. That's, in my mind, what a 4.0 is. And it tells me that a lot of the modern reads are not very exceptional. While a lot of them are. You could say that even the majority of my favorite reads, 4.5 and higher, are actually 2020 books. But I think part of that is just a matter of having read so many. On average, even if we look closer here, the average rating of all the books in 2020s were about 4.0. Compare that to, say, late 2020s, 2016, 2020, it's 4.36. And while we're only dealing with 14 books on average here, I think it says something about the time period. Well, one, I think there's the recency of the late 2010s. There's the recency there. That means I've been more exposed to them, so I'm probably more familiar with them, more aware of whether or not a book will be good for me. While the more modern books, I still have the hype of them being discussed, while still not being quite as familiar with the overall quality of what they're providing. And perhaps I'm reading too much into this, but that's sort of what I'm taking away from this and why I sort of try to want to gravitate away from that. As we get to the earlier years, like the averages range from 3.8 to 5.0, but the number of books I've been reading there are really quite low. I think it's just enough to say that the more modern books, a lot of them are mid, even if some of them are really good. And I think it's not that I should not be reading modern books. I think I need to be more deliberate about the books that I'm picking up. Because I think I'm letting hype drive me just to pick up a book because it's popular, because it's the new hot thing. And in reality, I should be more deliberate, or rather I want to be more deliberate. It's not about should, it's about what I want, and what I want is for me to be more deliberate in what I'm picking up. Let's think about this now, that my goals moving forward. Given that the split of the books that I had read, 2020 as being 2/3 of what I read, I want to get it down to 35%. And if my goal is to read 100 books in a year, that means 35 of the books that I read this year can be published in the 2020s onward. And that's something I'm going to try really hard to look at the books when they're published and ask myself, how many am I at? Because if I do that, it gives me plenty of books to read, while also pushing me to be more deliberate about whether or not a newer book is something that I really, really want to read. And I did just think that's a nice rule to set up for myself, just to see how it would play out this year. Then for the 2010s, I'd love to go from 20% to 25%. This is not nearly as drastic a change as with the 2020s, but I also think this will be much more manageable. If I'm reading less 2020s, I think the next biggest thing I'll pick up is the 2010s. So I'm going to be aiming for 25 books of the 100 that I'm aiming for in the 2010s. While the 2000s, I thought not 6%, this is the biggest of, I think. I would love to get up to 20%. I think there were a lot of books that appealed to me that are just not quite as recent, so I'm not quite as on my radar, even though they might be deserving of being my radar. I think what I'm going to be doing, again, is just to try to pick up more of these. Instead of having 5 or 6 books in this decade, I'm going to be going for 20 books. I'm going to think to myself, when is this book published? If it's in the 2000s, it won't be the reason that I read it, but I think much more likely to choose that book than another one. And the same with the 2020s. If it's that, I'll be less likely to read it. And then finally, the 1900s. I'm at 10%. I'd love to double that. I'd say 1900s. 1900s and sooner. I'd love to make that 10% of 20% of what I read. 20 books. A big part of that is reading classics. Now, just thinking about the actual highlights by publication year, this is a chance for me to talk about some of the books that I haven't talked about already. And I say highlights because they might not be the best of the best, because those I've already talked about, But these are some books that really stood out for various reasons. Let's start with books that were published before 1950, of which there were only 3 that I read. But the one I'm picking here is Indubious Battle by John Steinbeck. This wasn't my favorite by John Steinbeck. I think I gave it maybe 3.5. But it was a really interesting look at unions, the labor movement, and how people fight for that, and how people on both sides, both in industry and the advocates, are willing to sacrifice the people who are working for their own gain, for the greater good, whether the good be what they consider the good of the people or for the good of their own personal capital gain. 1950s to 1999, I'm going to go with Notes from Nader's Son by James Baldwin. This is one that I don't think quite stood out enough to be best of the best, but I also realized when I did my best of the best video, I think I did 9 out of 10, and I think if I had ended up doing 10 books, I probably would have ended up putting this one on there. I messed up the number. I read several of his books this year in the James Baldwin Readathon, and they were all really good. This one I think stood out the most. One, because I've read his books before, and this was an essay collection, and so this was like a chance to see his ideas explored more explicitly than they are more symbolically in his works of fiction. In the 2000s, one that I think I only gave 3.5 stars was Demon Theory by Stephen Graham Jones, but I want to provide this one because a lot of the other ones were already best of the best, because this really highlights Stephen Graham Jones and his skill at doing unique approaches. This is basically 3 screenplays, like a trilogy of a slasher rather. They're each focusing on completely different characters, and at times the structure of a screenplay and the changing of characters, changing of scene at times is disconcerting. And that's how I've had that complaint about some of his works, but at the same time, I still get really excited about them because of his willingness to try new things and just do this sort of abstract, unique style. And while it is disconcerting, not necessarily making for the best experience, overall the experience is unique enough. And I just really do appreciate it, and I will continue to seek out his work, especially his more experimental stuff, like in Demon Theory. In the 2020s, a lot of my favorites were already in my best of list. So what I'm going to talk about here instead is going to be The Infinite Miles by Hannah Ferguson. This wasn't my biggest surprises. I want to highlight this here for 2 reasons. One, it's still a very underrated book. It's basically a fan fiction-y take on Doctor Who, but instead of Doctor Who, it sort of mashes Doctor Who with David Bowie and sort of the Space Odyssey, the Spaceman, and also with the sort of muscle car of Back to the Future. It is at its core really just Doctor Who. It is just a really fun ride that I think will excite anyone who just loves Doctor Who, Back to the Future, and David Bowie. Now moving on to more of the stats about where these books are coming from. And for this, I transitioned from past years where I think I focused specifically on stats of different authors. And I'm approaching this a new way where I'm going to now be presenting whether or not an author is intersectional. And that is supposed to be encompassing a wide array of different perspectives. And this is just meant to highlight, one, how many of those I'm actually reading, which is 40% of what I'm reading, which I feel like I'm very satisfied with. I wouldn't mind getting up to 50%, but in general, it shows that I am seeking out different experiences. And I think if I get that number to 50%, it's a good number to stick at it. It shows that I am reading new and underrepresented experiences. I think it matters the type of experience that I'm exposing myself to when it comes to how I think about it and how satisfied I am with that sort of diversity of readings. I've approaching it in this new way as a way to try to make sure that I am reading a range of perspectives without necessarily fixating too much on specific identities and tokenizing people. And it's been really difficult to try and figure out how I diversify my reading without doing the tokenization that I'm hinting at here. And as far as to why I would want to do that, besides just wanting to experience new things and learn new things, this shows quantitatively that intersectional authors do better for me. 4.23, basically 4.25 stars versus 3.9 stars for non-intersectional authors. Just objectively, I enjoy those books more, and this really highlights that, and I think it justifies my desire and decision to intentionally seek out intersectional authors. Again, kind of like with the publication years, I'm not going to read something just because it's an intersectional author, but if it's a series of books that I'm interested in, if one happens to be intersectional, it makes me more likely to read it. Again, don't think this is like me saying, oh, I have these rules I have to follow. Rather, it's just representing or identifying the things that influence my decision, if not decide my decision. And as far as some best highlights from intersectional authors, I think I'll just highlight 3 here. M is for Monster by Talia Dutton is a middle grade comic or graphic novel. Basically, it's sort of a queer Frankenstein retelling. It was cute, a lot of fun. I read it with my partner. I really enjoyed it. This, again, if I had remembered that I was at 9, not 10 books and best of the best, I may have included this. One, because it was a 5-star. I can't say it's my favorite, though, because It's just I'm not necessarily that excited about graphic novels, even if I enjoy the unique and just very heartwarming type of story. But I think it was a good candidate, which is why I'm mentioning it here. Similarly, out there, Screaming by Jordan Peele, another one that may have been a contender for that 10th spot if I had remembered that I was at 10. This was, I thought, a solid anthology of horror stories. Even those that did not stand out to me had a very deliberate purpose in how they were utilizing horror. And in my opinion, that is the best horror that has a purpose. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. And overall, I actually really loved this anthology. The fact that I didn't get it on my final list was probably more clerical error than anything else. I also want to mention one more, a book that I read after my best of list, and I've also debated whether or not I may consider it a candidate for next year's best of the list, since that came after. But it was A Light Most Hateful by Haley Piper, and Haley Piper was actually one of the authors on my best of list. I love her writing style. I loved this one too. It was even better horror than I think the one that was on my best of list. And it's sort of a horror personal book that looks at identity and trauma and in friendship. And it's very queer, and it's just delightful. I have a review coming out, a standalone review. But what I'll say is I wouldn't necessarily look at the genres that are listed on Goodreads, because I think it kind of spoils the surprise. But just go in not knowing what it's about, because it explores trauma and how that influences how we treat others. It's just a wonderful book. Honestly, my favorite of these three. Like I said, it's seriously a contender for possibly being best of next year, just because I didn't have a chance to put it on this one. Haley Piper, I really suggest checking her out. And now we are moving on to the source and reason that I read books. And now I'm approaching this differently than I have in past years, probably because I don't have a physical TBR anymore, so I can't really see how it's coming from. And because I want to talk about the method, or rather the way in which I'm getting books, which is almost always an audio version, and also the reason though I picked it up. Looking first at the reason, we can see a big chunk of them are arcs, and I've actually gotten my arcs up this year, the average up to over 80%, which I'm really excited about. And now at this point that it's there, it's really hard to get it down significantly, just because I have so many books that I've now reviewed, and I'm really excited about that. I don't know if I'll be quite as enthusiastic about arcs this year, if only because of my publishing year goal here now. Because of that, I have to be much more deliberate about the books I pick up, and think to myself, is this really one of those few books that I'm letting myself read for this year? And that's something I'll be thinking about as I start to request new books. Personal reasons is just why I can't really justify any other reason. A book club being James Baldwin, usually, James Baldwin Readathon. Videos, of course, are personal. I rarely read things because I'm trying to do it for a project, but I sometimes justify my personal reasons with a project. And then rereads, these are books that are basically personal for rereads, but a lot of these other ones, several of the other ones rather, are also rereads. Like, for example, the book club, I think at least one or two of those were actually a reread as well, but I classified them in book club. As far as the sources, I made a deliberate effort to try and pick up Libby whenever possible. Instead of just going out and trying to buy the book, my first goal is to go and see if I can get it from my local library. I am in Australia, but my permanent address is in the States, and I just use my library there. On top of that, I've been getting more audio arcs, so that's a good fraction of it. Scribd, another one, and then if it's not on those, I will go to Audible. Sometimes there's a rare case where I'll read an ebook. That would be other. There are other times where I might get it from audiobooks.com or even Google Play Books. So these are the other category where sometimes the more obscure I can't necessarily find them. Of course, text-to-speech. And I've actually debated whether or not I want to do a video I talk about text-to-speech, but I'm just not sure if others are as enthusiastic as I am. And I don't seek out text-to-speech if there's an audio version. I will always strive to get a paid version. Even if it is international, I will try to pay for it internationally and to get access to it. But there have been some great advancements in text-to-speech, and it makes reading books that aren't on audio just much more accessible. For a while, I was doing text-to-speech with my Kindle, which was really robotic. I started paying this year for Natural Reader. I debated if I was going to continue because it's better than a standard free version, but still very robotic. And when they recently released a new version, they call it a large language model version, the voice is nearly as good as the one you get from the talking version of ChatGPT. And while it still lacks the emotion and inflection oftentimes of a personal reader, it is just remarkably better, and I think I'll actually be doing that a lot more this year. I could debate if I want to continue paying for my text-to-speech reader, not only because I do it for this, but also I read it sometimes for papers at work. But I'm going to be deliberately trying to just pick up more books, especially when we talk about older books. Another reason I don't read older books is because they're not usually on audio as often. And of course, classics are, but the more obscure ones aren't. These advancements in text-to-speech make them much more accessible for me. And I'm really excited to be doing that more. If you're curious or either interested in hearing my conversation about the value of text-to-speech and about my experience with natural readers specifically, let me know. I debated again if that's a video worth making. Let me know in the comments if you think it is, or something you're interested in hearing about it. Then Audible is a big fraction. Sometimes I can't find a book anywhere else and I have an Audible account. Audible's expensive, I'm not gonna lie. But I don't pretend this channel is like paying for itself. I get no money from this channel at all. But I read books because I want to. That's why when I talk about the reason I read a book, if I do a video, it needs to be a book that I already want to read, almost always. And then as far as my logic behind all this, again, I don't really need to justify the reasons I want to do more of one thing or another. But if we look here at my rankings again, I don't know if there's really much of a pattern here. The book club average is high, but that's because I love James Baldwin. The rereads are high naturally because I did love rereads. That said, I don't always reread books that I feel are perfect. Sometimes there are comfort reads, like Replay by Ken Grimwood, where I love the idea, but the more I read it, the more I think to myself, this has so many problems. Whether or not I should still be reading them is a question to itself that I will not be getting into here. And then videos, I'd say it's about the same. It's just a regular personal and video about the same. So it just tells you that on average, when I pick up a book because I want to, for any reason, even ARC's, I guess ARC's doing pretty good too, 3.9, they're all 3.9. So that tells me that I'm actually doing a decent job in picking up ARCs that I'll like. But maybe I should still be more deliberate, at least if I limit myself to how many I can pick up, even if it's not ARC specifically so much as just the publication year, I think maybe that number could go up in the next year. We're almost to the end here. Let's talk about some of my favorite, I guess, superlatives, to use Mara's terminology. Let's start with best arc. And again, a lot of my favorites were actually arcs. So I'm going to focus on one that was actually my biggest surprises. That's going to be Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. This was a great trans horror book that looked at what it's like to be trans, but also the path to TERFdom, how people can follow into that pathway, and also just using horror that I love, Shirley Jackson-y, dark supernatural horror. It's just really good. And it was like just so close to being a great contender, her best of the best, or being my best. But this is going to be something I would turn to because I think the content is really impactful. My favorite video, I thought about this. I did some really great reviews that I honestly really am proud of. But my favorite video is going to be the one of two vlogs that I did. It's going to be Reading Trans and Non-Binary Horror Vlog, where I really enjoyed that. I loved editing it, and I loved rewatching it. There were a lot of great books there. It gave me a chance to seek out horror by trans and non-binary authors, and I think it's what exposed me to Haley Piper, one of my new favorites. It was such a great experience, so please check that out. I love my vlogs, and it takes so much time, so it's so satisfying when it's actually done. Biggest surprise reread. And for this, I'm going to go with Girls Born Brighter. This one, I think I almost did a full standalone review for, just because of how much my thoughts on it had progressed. I think I'll talk about it in my mid-year wrap-up, so check that out if you want to see it. I think I'll also have a written review on Goodreads. The short end of it, though, is that I compared this originally to Handmaid's Tale, and I feel like that comparison is there, but in a way that I think underappreciates the value of this book, which explores the role of the patriarchy and abuse towards women in a much more modern and a much more intersectional way. And it's just a really amazing book that I'm so happy that I reread. And if you haven't read it yet, even if you had, you should just give it another read. And finally, I just want to go again say I love being a part of the James Baldwin Readathon. I'm really glad Erica invited me to be a part of that, and I'm excited to continue it going. Make sure you check it out if you haven't been checking it out. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is going to be genre. These last plots are mostly by me. The first one is going to be the primary genre. I've come to accept that the green category, contemporary, classical, and historical, simply are just not something I'm that excited about. And so maybe I'm not as diverse a reader as I would like to. I read a lot of things, especially when it comes to nonfiction. I'm excited that it was over 25%, but still the bulk of it is going to be fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. And that's just the reality of it. I am done actively seeking out books that are, because they're historical, because they're literary or contemporary, because I just don't think those books appeal to me as much. I do love a literary book, but usually if it's literary horror, literary fantasy, literary sci-fi, and usually I categorize those as such. When it comes to nonfiction, again, you can see I love memoirs, and I love history, and I love science. And oftentimes those are intersectional in the sense that they all intersect with each other. And that is more evident if we go to all the subgenres added together, this next plot, which in short just means if a book fits into a genre, that genre gets a +1. So one book will count towards multiple genre in this plot. This puts fantasy at the lead,
of both sci-fi and horror, which if you didn't notice was the smallest fraction. That's just because oftentimes the sci-fi books have a hint of fantasy. The horror books oftentimes have fantasy because I love supernatural, fantastical horror. And then when we go to nonfiction, you see history take the lead because a lot of the memoirs or biographies that I read are by historical or political figures. The same with science. Science there's more of as well. I think 2 more books. I'll show this plot to close out this vlog. To close out this video. I don't have a lot to say, largely because there's not a lot of high sample sizes for a lot of these options. Horror has 22 books with 3.9, and that one is a bit surprising, while memoirs 4.0, mystery thrillers 3.5, that's consistent with my feelings about mysteries and thrillers. Sci-fi 3.75, even lower than horror. I did not realize that actually. In science 3.7, that checks out. Science books can be really hit or miss, depending on the ability of the writer to be a good science writer. Fantasy, where the hell is fantasy? 4.32. Fantasy seems like the highest one. Maybe that's consistent with what I like. I love fantasy. I am surprised that horror did not have a higher average. I don't know what to make of this. Maybe it's because I love horror, I'm more likely to pick it up if it happens to be horror, even if I think I may not like it. I think that's probably a true assessment. So maybe I should be a bit more picky. But at the same time, I love reading horror, and I'm glad I read more of it. So there's not much that I'm going to be changing with my reading style based off of this, but it's still fun to look at the stats. I don't really have best of genre. There's a wide array of genres in my best of list and my biggest surprises, so I would just honestly just go there because there are too many genres here to pick a book for everyone. This has been a bit of a lengthy video, but those are all the stats and some of my superlative books that I have read, and also, I guess, different things from my channel. I hope you've enjoyed this. I really enjoyed this. I love this new format that I'm doing where I sort of present other things beyond just the raw stats. Of course, that's not my original idea. I get inspired by a number of amazing other booktubers whose way of approaching wrap-ups have really influenced how I think about this. And I just, I love seeing wrap-ups, I love seeing stats, and I love being inspired by the booktubers. Listening to my favorite booktubers of the year, whether it be Mara from Books Like Row, Books on La, Angela from the Literary Science Alliance, just to name a few of my favorites, I guess. Those 3 are probably among them, but not exclusively them, to be clear. Thanks again for watching. It's been a lot of fun. If you made it to the end, I don't know, give your thoughts on my stats. That's all I can take. If there's any commentary you'd like to give, any suggestions as far as how I can approach some of these goals that I've set for myself, let me know. As always, hope you have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.